Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. My name is Elliot Roseman. I'm with the United States Energy Association. Welcome to this, if I may say, timely webinar on electricity capacity markets, costs and benefits. I like to simply call this topic, how do we best keep the lights on? As you're probably aware, there are a myriad of cross-cutting factors affecting electricity markets today. I'll just mention a few. There are huge additions anticipated and taking place of intermittent resources, mostly wind and solar, both because of the low prices of those resources, and in many states and in many countries, and in Europe in particular, there are renewable portfolio standard targets and targets to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, there is significant pressure on traditional baseload resources, both coal, lignite, and on nuclear, as their operating costs are higher than some of those resources I just mentioned, and in Europe in particular, carbon prices, which add a cost obviously to those resources. Third, there are major increases taking place and expected in on-site generation and generation on the distribution system. So electric vehicles, microgrids, rooftop solar. And then there are technology wildcards like storage and like carbon capture technologies. That's on the supply side. On the demand side, we also have a tremendous number of changes. The patterns of demand are changing, and the need for electricity is changing faster or slower in some regions and will be affected by the coronavirus as well. As certain industries do not come back or do not come back as quickly or come back very quickly, and some will rise faster or slower. And the pattern and location of demand is going to change as well. As with more people working at home, we'll probably have more demand taking place on the residential side and maybe less in the commercial sector. There's so many changes, but what we can all agree on, I believe, is that we need to keep the lights on, and we want to do so at a reasonable price and with respect for the environment. So we have those three pillars. We have the reliability, we have the pricing, and we have the environment. On the one hand, on the other hand, and economists always need more hands. Now, we could keep the lights on through what I'll call traditional means, integrated resource planning, where utilities and regulators and other stakeholders sit down in some kind of a forum and agree on what new generation is required, on what should be retired, what new transmission or other resources, energy efficiency will be part of the mix in the future. It could be done through bilateral contracts with independent power producers or with seasonal exchanges between utilities or between countries. There's a myriad of different ways, and our speakers today are going to be talking about that spectrum with a focus on the differences and the costs and benefits of markets for providing that capacity. That's really the focus of today's discussion. It's for those answers that in a few moments I'll turn things over first to Craig Glazer with the PJM, and then to Fabian Rokas with Compass Lexicon to take us through those questions and those issues. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to read their biographies. They are in the flyer that you've received. Suffice it to say that these are experienced, distinguished gentlemen in their fields, and I think you're going to be very pleased with the level of information that we are going to be conveying to you today. What I do want to say, though, is vital is your participation. While you're listening, your job is to think about what else do I want to know? What is not quite clear to me? Because I guarantee if you have the question, there's many other people on this webinar who have the same question in their mind. One thing you do not need to ask, though, is whether or not these slides will be available. They will be. We're going to be posting the slides that you'll see today on the USEA website shortly after this webinar, so you don't need to ask about whether or not the slides will be available. We have a very diverse set of participants and registrations for this webinar here. We have people from 17 different countries on the line today. We have a huge range of organizations and disciplines that are involved. Now, partly that is because we originally planned this webinar as being focused for the Electricity Market Initiative for Southeast Europe, which is the group for USEA that I direct. But then we decided to open it up, and it's good that we did, given the huge response that we've had from all over the globe as a result for this topic. But what you will see as a result of that original planning is that we have references. Both of our speakers have references in their presentations to Southeast Europe. Craig focusing more on the US and on PJM, Fabian more on Europe, but there are slides on Southeast Europe in particular. But the messages and the lessons are universal. As I said, I have questions that I'm all set to ask these gentlemen, but I really want, as much as possible, for the queries to come from you. We'll get to as many as we can, and if we can't, we'll be able to pose them to our experts offline so that you get the answers that you want. Lastly, I want to say that this webinar is presented courtesy of and with support of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, whose support and partnership is fundamental and which we completely appreciate, and without whom we could not present information like this. It is with them and with your participation that we're delighted to be able to bring and offer this kind of information to enhance the level of discussion and improve the energy systems in which we work together. And with that, Craig Glazer from the PJM, I'll turn things over to you. Please get us started.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. Hopefully you all can hear me. And I first want to thank Elliot, who's done wonderful work in this region, as well as USEA for hosting this, and say hello to all my friends in Europe. I really, particularly here in this beautiful month of June, would have loved to have done this in person with you all, but this is a new world. To just show you, as we're all getting used to this technology, how sort of new this is, and frankly, how personal this is to me. This weekend, my son, my only son, is actually getting married. He's getting married in California, about over a continent away from where we are here on the East Coast of the US. And the entire wedding is being done through Zoom. Entire wedding done virtually. There'll be 3 people in attendance, and us as the parents and others will all be on Zoom. So it is a new world. Hopefully that'll work, and hopefully this will work today as we're getting used to this technology. But thank you for participating, and I welcome your questions, and really, to be honest, want to be a resource to you. I am PJM's Vice President of Federal Government Policy. I'm here in Washington, D.C., but one of the joys of this job, frankly, is to spend time with my colleagues all around the world, and USEA and USAID have been very helpful to that. So I look forward to this. If we can, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the capacity markets in the United States, with a particular focus on PJM, do some compare and contrast to what I know of your situation. And again, you take away from this what is relevant to you. We're certainly not saying the PJM model is the right model for the region or anything like that, but I did want to share this. And frankly, capacity markets have not been easy. I had a lot less gray hair and more hair when we started this discussion than I do now. It has been a constant source of dispute and debate, a healthy debate in the US about capacity markets, some successes and some challenges, which I'll get to. So if we could go to the first slide. So just a quick word about PJM. Many of you may know PJM. I welcome the opportunity to chat with you more in the future, but we are a regional transmission organization with 3 key functions: reliability of the grid, operation of the market, as well as regional planning, directing the build out of the transmission system. Next slide. And PJM operates really the largest competitive wholesale market in the United States, and one of the largest in the world. So we have 165,000 megawatts of load, 180,000 megawatts of generation, and over 65 million people served in the PJM region, probably the most densely populated part of the US. Next slide. That being said, we're not the only regional transmission or independent regional transmission organization. This is a map of the US and Canada, and roughly about 2/3, particularly from a population point of view. A lot of Western states are developing forms of markets, but there's also not this population density. So in 2/3 of the US and much of Canada are served by our sister organizations in other parts of the North America. Next slide. Also, it's interesting, and we'll come back to this, how this sort of compares and contrasts, but PJM system mix is really extremely diverse. In fact, it's ironically, even in this age of focus on climate change and retirements of generation, our mix is actually more diverse than it's ever been. When I first started in this organization, we were coal and nuclear heavy, but today we're roughly 1/3 gas, 1/3 nuclear, 1/3 coal. Renewables are a smaller part from a capacity point of view, but an increasingly growing part of the energy mix. And the future of generation in our queue is made up of natural gas and renewables. Moving next slide. By the same token, the market has really accomplished, and I say the capacity market doesn't, there's a lot of things that have happened that have caused this to happen, Paris Accords and others, but the capacity market has helped to be very welcoming to new cleaner technologies and also very harsh on older inefficient technologies, which happen to be the more carbon intensive. So we've seen significant retirements of coal units in our footprint, which has led to a significant reduction since 2005 in emissions. We can go to the next slide. So what do we do in PJM? We actually operate markets, obviously, and the markets that we operate are the ones that are closest to and tied integrally to grid operations. So we're responsible for grid operations, therefore we operate a real-time market, taking bids in real time for energy on a 5-minute basis. We operate a market for ancillary services, and we operate a day-ahead energy market as well. In addition, a market for transmission rights, and this what's the bullet that's marked, or the bubble that's marked reliability pricing model is the capacity market. All of the markets in blue are operated by us. They are regulated by a single regulator at the federal level. And then off in the green are all of the financial markets that depend on the price signals from the day ahead and real-time market. Those are not regulated by us. They are not operated by us, but are heavily dependent on the price signals from the real-time market. Next slide. So, okay, let me start with, and I certainly have done this through just some observations from work I've done in Europe. PJM's representative to the International Energy Agency, so I've tried to keep abreast of what's happening in Europe. And I think there are some similarities and some notable differences between our systems. If we go to the first bullet, some of the similarities is that in many cases, generation resources are distant from load. We see that in PJM. We've got the wind farms up on the mountain ridges and the population centers, obviously, along the coast. So we struggle with all the issues associated with generation distant from load. Next one. Like many other systems, we have a mix of independent power producers and legacy-owned, publicly owned generation, state-owned generation, in our case sometimes municipally owned or cooperative generation, and a mix of that with pure competitive generation. And the next bullet. We also, the energy market is voluntary. So really, and particularly renewable resources depend on long-term purchase power agreements. They are available and they are respected in the dispatch. So I think those are some similarities to what I know of the European system. But there's some significant differences. If we could go to the next slide as well. Some of those differences, if you could start, Albert. As I said, we have a very diverse resource mix. So I don't have any one particular resource, unlike some of your countries, that is dominant. I don't have hydro dominant, like coal, gas, or nuclear. We have this very healthy mix. And the capacity markets actually help to ensure that diversity of resources. Next bullet. Also, we have a mix that's sort of, I always view the US as sort of a mini version of Europe, in the sense that you have the EU and individual regulators at the national level. Our equivalent of that is federal regulators that regulate PJM and the other RTOs, and individual states that have a regulatory responsibility as well, although they don't regulate us directly. Next bullet. And that's a key difference. We also have most of our generation, particularly in PJM. This is not true in much of the country, but is it true in California and true in PJM, true in New England? Most generation has been deregulated and dependent on market revenues for recovery of costs. We don't have that much traditional regulation of generation included in rate base and guaranteed a return. That's starting to change a little bit, but we have most of it is competitive. Last bullet. And we also operate a locational marginal price energy market, and we've had that from the very beginning. Next slide. So a lot of history as to flavors of capacity markets in the US. There is no single model. We have a bid-based auction system, which I will talk about in a few moments, but that's only one flavor of what's out there in that country. Next bullet. The next bullet with that. Okay, so we have just to our west, the Midwest ISO, another regional transmission organization, has a completely different model. It is a decentralized obligation where long-term regulators direct the building of new capacity. Long-term contracts are entered into, and a regional transmission organization really is a sort of, has the ultimate responsibility, but is sort of gathering the array of contracts and regulatory commands and sort of putting those together into a system onto generation that can then be dispatched. So it's a much more decentralized model where the regional transmission organization doesn't take bids, doesn't centrally clear the resources. Instead, everybody does their own thing and brings their resources to the table. Next bullet. Another model that is out there in the US is bundled purchases of capacity and energy, where you really can't separate those two. Effectively, in the ERCOT in Texas, we have sort of where it's an energy-only market, but the capacity obligation, if you will, to keep the lights on is happening through energy prices, and capacity sort of part and parcel of that. Next bullet. Lots of, and one next to it, we've got also other flavors in the United States of fixed long-term contracts to procure capacity. We've got basically, in some cases, federally regulated buying organizations. We've got municipals that enter into long-term arrangements. And that's how capacity is, that's how the lights are kept on. A series of long-term arrangements, really no particular entity is gathering it all together like a regional transmission organization. This is the model in the western part of the United States, where just sort of everybody does their own thing, enters into long-term contracts to meet their load with no sort of centralizing organization around it. And last bullet is a much more limited procurement of reserves in real time. This is also probably an example of the Texas model, where there is no forward obligation, there is no forward procurement. It's sort of all done in real time with purchase of energy, but also purchase of reserves. So That's lots of flavors as you travel. If you got in a car and traveled around the U.S., I could take you to a spot, very pretty spot, where you could see each one of these models in action. Very diverse system, and a lot of debate in the U.S. which of these is the right model, if you will. And continual debate on that subject. But I want to spend obviously most of the time now on the PJM model because it is probably the most compatible with a restructured market. It is probably the most compatible with attracting new resources and sending an investment price signal to drive investment as well as retirement of resources. And frankly, I would argue it is the most attractive for both renewables as well as new technologies. And we can get to that in a minute. Moving forward, next slide. So what are we trying to do in our capacity market? What's the goal? What's the purpose of it? One is to send long-term locational investment signals. Really, that's sort of a key part. We are taking bids, we are clearing the market with the goal of coming up with a single, or in some cases, a locational price signal of what is sort of the most efficient price of new investment, and sending that signal to the investor. Next bullet. We're also, as I mentioned, hand in hand, sending forward closure signals for inefficient units. I've talked about how a lot of coal units have retired because while we're sending an investment signal of here's the value and cost of value of new efficient generation, that's also sending a signal that if I've got a high cost, inefficient coal unit as an example, this is sending me a signal that that's probably not the competitive mix that customers need for the future. So the two go hand in hand. Next bullet. Competition in the procurement of capacity. Unlike long-term arrangements or regulatory driven, we really are trying to drive competition in the procurement. Is it a full market or a administrative mechanism? It's a little bit of both, but fundamentally the idea is we take bids and we have a lot of competition, and we've seen that in the market. Next bullet. Provide revenue stability. So this is sometimes, I hate this expression, but it's sometimes called missing money. If you just depend on the energy markets, built into that market is going to be a risk premium. A risk premium to reflect the fact that, at least here in the East, day like today, the weather is a lot cooler. June has been a cooler month than normal. So revenues are down, and rather than having all that volatility of depending on the vagaries of the weather or the impacts of COVID or the impacts of the economy, the capacity markets helps to provide a degree of revenue stability that benefits customers because that risk premium that would otherwise be built into the energy market does not have to be there. Next bullet. It's also one of the other goals we have is, I talked about new technologies. We treat demand side response, we treat new technologies, storage and batteries as capacity resources. We are providing a forward price that they can then, a forward guarantee if they clear, that they can then use to deal with the hurdle rates. We've oftentimes have office buildings that say, well, gee, I could put in this energy efficiency measure and it'll save me money over time, but I've got this big capital cost addition, so I'm not going to do it because I don't want to spend the money right now. The capacity market helps to get over that problem because we are valuing the value of that energy efficiency investment to us, providing if it clears, providing a revenue stream that helps to deal with that upfront capital cost. And finally, Albert, if we also ensures non-discrimination. I like to say the controller in the control room can do one of two things. We're coming up here in the US on the 9 o'clock in the morning hour. It's getting a little bit warmer than it was in the prior hour. The controller is indifferent whether it calls on a supply side resource or reduces load to a demand side resource. It's the same. fact, in some ways, the demand side resource may even be better for that. But this really sets a level playing field between the two. Next slide. So how does it work in PJM? We've talked about the goals. We've talked about the flavors of it. Let me get a little bit more specific into the elements of it, and we can certainly come back on questions. One is it's a 3-year forward auction. We run the auction once a year. We are taking bids to deliver capacity 3 years in the future. Again, sending that forward investment signal, but also ensuring that because power plants can't be built overnight, that we know what we've got 3 years ahead. We're not guessing as to what might show up as we look at the load forecast going forward. Next one. What's the product? People often ask, what's the product? It's actually what we are asking customers to pay for is insurance. It's basically a call right that we have on energy during emergencies. So what does that, what does all that words mean? Means I'm a generator in PJM, but I'm selling to Ontario. I'm selling to New England. I'm selling to New York, which I can do because it's a hot day and I have better prices there. But suddenly PJM declares a system emergency of some sort. We call up that generator and say, you have to curtail that transaction to New York, to Ontario, wherever. We are asking you to deliver to PJM and run at our direction. So it's effectively a call right on energy during emergencies. Next bullet. It's a locational price based on transmission constraints. So it's not a single price across the large region. Next bullet. All resources can participate. Essentially what we're doing is, and this is controversial, but we as the RTO are procuring capacity on behalf of all of the loads in the region. On behalf of 65 million people in the United States, we PJM are procuring capacity on their behalf. As I said, we could ask everybody to go get their own capacity and bring it to us. That's what our organization to the west does. But in this case, we are centrally procuring, and as a result, getting the most efficient mix of that generation to serve the needs of the customers. And because we have the reliability responsibility, we probably are the best ones to know what we need, if you will, and can procure that with people centrally bidding so that we've got healthy competition in obtaining what we need. Next bullet. We, needless to say, and this is actually very relevant right now, post-COVID, we've seen, as you've seen in Europe, we've seen, loads substantially reduced, roughly about 8 to 10%. Frankly, I would have thought it would be higher than that, but as people are working at home, we're seeing about a 10% reduction in peak and about 8% in energy. So we have incremental auctions between the 3 years where we can adjust to reflect updated load forecasts. Why don't we go to the next 2 bullets, Albert? It is a year-round obligation. So I'm buying 3 years forward for what's called the delivery year. And you are required to be available in that delivery year. If you don't deliver, there are substantial penalties for non-performance during emergencies. One of the questions that's come up is, well, what if I'm a planned resource? I bid in, I'm not built yet. I want to, but I commit to PJM that I will construct and get this unit in service 3 years from now, which for a natural gas unit in the US, you could probably do. And if you are, and we clear that and we say, okay, you got it, we're going to count on you to do that. If you fail to deliver, you can either buy yourself out in an incremental auction, but if you don't, the penalties for non-delivery are substantial to wipe out all the benefit of that. So there's a powerful economic signal to make sure if you're a planned resource, you're going to deliver or get out, if you will, and buy your way out. And frankly, finally, the market is very susceptible to market power. The market can be dominated by a few large players because it is a single clearing price market. As a result of that, we basically mitigate everyone to cost. It is bids, but the bids are effectively at their cost. They're not at market prices, with some exceptions we can talk about, but there is a fair amount of market power mitigation. I know I've been going a while here, but let me just go a couple more points. One of the criticisms you will hear is, well, the problem with the capacity market is I can't enter into a long-term power purchase agreement for my wind units because of the capacity market. But to be honest, that criticism is out there, but I'm not sure it actually has panned out, because all of the capacity, all we are doing is sending a price signal to inform and frankly value those long-term arrangements. If you go to the next bullet, what people end up doing, buyers and sellers, is entering into a contract for differences around that capacity market price. So you have that capacity price, you write a contract for differences for a 10-year PPA, and at least the customer knows that the price they're paying is at least pegged to the value of that resource in the capacity market. Next bullet. And the 3-year forward requirement is designed, lots of debate. Should it be 3 years? Should it be 1 year? Should it be 5 years, 10 years? We've been through all that. We found 3 years forward is sort of a good landing place between a reasonable forward commitment. So we know what we've got and we're sending the right price signal, while not locking up and making decisions that will bind people for 10 years. I used to be a regulator, and we made a lot of decisions that bound customers bet on technologies that didn't pan out. And again, you look at, this is 2020, what we thought in 2010 was going to happen in 2020 versus what has is substantially different. So we found 3 years probably the right balance between those two. Go to the next slide. I'm actually going to skip over this slide. Let's skip over this slide in the interest of time here. And I'll just give you a moment here so it looks a little busy here, but this is how it works. So in May of each year, we have what on the far left, we have what's called a base residual auction. And that is for a delivery year starting June 3 years forward. So this now it didn't happen this year, but that's for a bunch of other reasons. But in May of 2020, had we been on a regular schedule, we would have held the auction for a delivery year starting June of 2023 to May of 2024. That's the period that people are committing to. During that 3-year period, as you can see, there's various incremental auctions and an ongoing bilateral market where people can buy out of their positions. If they boosted their capacity, they can put more into the market. If they're having some technology issues or the plant's not getting built in time, they can buy out of their position. Next slide. So it is certainly a market on the supply side in the sense that we've taken a lot of bids. On the demand side, setting the demand for reliability is a more difficult thing. I can't call up and say, here's my reliability need for today. And here it is, and this is what I want, and here's what I want 3 years from now, here's where I'm gonna be, etc. So we as the RTO sort of have to come up with a demand curve. We have to sort of postulate what the customers will need and what they will value. And so we've come up with the concept of a downward sloping demand curve. We'll go to the 2 bullets, Albert, if you can. So basically, because it's a sloping demand curve, what we're doing is we're saying, we used to have a vertical demand curve. What that meant is we bought just the amount of capacity we needed, and that had a very high cost, and then the next megawatt had no value. And reliability is a much more diverse product than that. In fact, what we were doing is we were shortchanging the fact that given uncertainties, more is better, and I can get more reliability at a cheaper price, sort of cheaper by the dozen, if you will. And so I come up with a sloping demand curve that recognizes that prices are higher when the resources are less, but there is a value for me having excess reserves. Not as high as if I'm short, but there's value, and therefore we've come up with a sloping demand curve. If you go to the next slide, you can see it. Essentially, the IRM is the reserve margin requirement. And as you can see, if you look to the right, as we're purchasing more than that, we're decreasing the price for that next megawatt, but increasing the amount that we're purchasing. Essentially providing value for the fact that additional reserves have value. There comes a point when they have no value, they're just so much, you don't need anymore. But in that in-between period, having that reliability value ought to be recognized. And that's a key feature of the capacity market. I'll just wrap up here with a couple of final points. Go to the next slide. As I mentioned, lots of different people. We are completely agnostic in terms of who can participate. So you'll see generation, demand response, energy efficiency, aggregating of renewable and storage, even transmission upgrades, all can bid in as resources in the capacity market. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but what have been the results? Next slide. That is our control room, by the way. Next slide is we've seen a lot of new generation cleared, new generation in service. As I mentioned, that generation, you'll see a lot in the 2015 to 2018 period. That was new generation that bid in some cases 3 years prior, that replaced a whole lot of inefficient coal. You'll see in 2020, 2021, the amount of new generation we need substantially less. And now with the economic downturn, perhaps less. But all of the green, all of the high bars represent the changeover of the fleet from coal to much cleaner resources. I used to be a state regulator. It used to take over a decade to change out a fleet, and we've been able to do it in 3 years and clean up the fleet and get a more efficient fleet than we've ever had. That's the beauty of what the market brings. Next slide. As you can see, the market reflects the move towards a more carbon-free set of resources, coal going down, gas going up, renewables and demand response going up as well. Next slide. Now, prices in this market have varied considerably. This is probably one of the criticisms of the market, because the market is very, very sensitive to, for example, transmission topology changes. We add a new transmission line or we have a major outage that really can affect, particularly in constrained parts of the system. I talked about the densely populated East Coast. That can really have an impact on prices. So that's not necessarily a positive of the market, the way the volatility, but transmission topology has a huge impact on what the prices that units clear at. So let me wrap up by talking about the good and the challenges. So on capacity markets, I probably made your head spin at this point, make my head spin whenever I talk about this issue. This has been years in the making. Next slide. So what has worked in the capacity market? I think I've said this a couple of times. We've attracted new investment, rapid turnover, decarbonization of the fleet. That is a proven success story. Next bullet. The market has encouraged development of new demand side technology. It is a home for the development and valuation and monetizing of new technologies. Next bullet. And we've also provided a home for renewables and hydro as well. Now, I have to be honest, wind in particular, but solar also, doesn't make most of their money in the capacity market. They make it in the energy market, which is where the bulk of the dollars are. Because of its intermittent nature, its capacity value, its nameplate value is substantially derated, I should say. to, we actually derate wind to roughly about a 16% of its nameplate, and solar to about a 40% of its nameplate. So it is a home for those, but certainly their value comes in the energy market. But it is a home that values them and gives them this added resource as opposed to just thermal resources. Next slide. That being said, this ain't without challenges. I mentioned the first one, pricing very sensitive to changes in grid topology. So it's not as volatile as the energy market, but it has had its ups and downs. Next bullet. The capacity market does tend to dampen the impact of shortage pricing. Texas is very dependent on shortage pricing. Prices last summer went up to $9,000. And the capacity market tends to dampen some of that. Some people will say that's good. Some people will say that's not good, but it definitely impacts the shortage pricing signal. I would argue subjecting prices to customers to $9,000 is not very palatable, politically sustainable. So it probably is a good tool to address those issues, but people can debate that. Next one. This has been a fairly contentious issue because our individual states often have different policy goals. I've got states that want to promote nuclear. I've got states that want to promote coal. I've got states that want to promote offshore wind. And the fundamental of the capacity market is all megawatts are the same. We don't paint electrons and we don't favor one resource over another. That's great and the right thing to do from a fair non-discrimination point of view. If a particular state, or in your case, a particular ministry has a different policy goal, that can get a little complicated with a multinational capacity market to the extent that market recognizes all megawatts the same. A few others, next bullets. The prices have been low, actually. Interestingly enough, people are worried about a fly up in prices, and we haven't seen that. Prices have generally been well below. People say, well, you're doing excessive mitigation. But in fact, people have been bidding below the authorized market mitigation caps. So market mitigation, market power mitigation has not been the heavy sledgehammer that people claimed it would be, because in fact, people are bidding well below those caps. The market's pretty competitive. And just a few others, next couple of bullets. Seasonal versus annual procurements. And PJM, we treat the capacity as a year-round commitment. So if I've got a summer air conditioning program, which we have a lot of here in the US, I have to pair that up with a winter energy efficiency or demand side program because it's an annual requirement. So the seasonal, and this has been an issue, the regulator has stayed with us on this, but it's a bit of a challenge because a program that is a summer air conditioning program that has value during our peak, I cannot give it its capacity value because it's a year-round product. Again, another issue, subsidization. I know that's a big issue in Europe, subsidized resources competing with non-subsidized resources. Guess what? We have that issue too. And that has caused, which we can talk about in Q&A, a lot of issues around how do you ensure this investment signal when one set of resources is getting money coming in from both pockets and the other resources don't. They depend solely on the capacity market. That's not a steady state by any means. And finally, next bullet. People have talked about, again, as I mentioned, I don't think there is this great challenge through long-term contracting. We've seen people writing contract for differences, but one common criticism you will hear is we get in the way of long-term contracting. And it is true that if I had a much more decentralized system and said, just bring us whatever you got, I'd have a lot more long-term contracting. I'm not sure I'd have better prices for customers or even for unit owners. I don't think I'd have any rational basis as to how those prices are formed and set. But so this is a criticism. I think it has some degree of truth, but there's a lot of balance to it as well. So with that, last slide. I want to be a resource to you, so I love talking about this stuff. Feel free to call me. We're shut down for a while in the US and Washington, just as you are in Europe, so I'm not sure when I'll next be in my office, but I'm happy to answer questions by email and chat some more about these things. So my thanks to Elliot, and I guess we're going to hold questions to the end, but thank you very much.
Right, great. Thanks, Craig. Excellent presentation. We are going to hold questions to the end because we want to make sure to give enough time to Fabian for his presentation. There's certainly a tremendous amount that you put on the table, though. So thank you very, very much. Fabian, let's Fabian Roques with Compass Lexicon. Let's turn to your perspective, which is more Europe centric, if I may say, in terms of its focus. So please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Elliot. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Very pleased to share some of my experience with capacity mechanisms in Europe. And indeed, we will have a specific focus on Southeast Europe. I mean, Craig has already mentioned a lot of the important things. So the good thing is that that's going to allow me to skip a number of my slides or to go a bit quicker than I anticipated on the first part of the webinar. So the presentation is going to be structured in 3 main steps. I'll say a few words as an introduction, then I'll, as I said, complement some of the points that have been mentioned by Craig on capacity mechanisms. And then I'll focus very much on the experience to date in Europe. I'll then move to the Balkans, where I happen to have done a bit of work recently, specifically focused on the issues of security of supply and the issues of capacity mechanism. So a few words about myself and Compass Lexicon. We are part of FTI Consulting, big international consulting company. We have offices across the world and provide a range of services. I am heading up the European practice for Compass Lexicon on the energy side, and as part of that, our team has been advising a number of regulators as well as private companies on the issues that we are discussing today. So you see on that map that capacity mechanisms have been a key focus in a number of countries, and this is where we've been working, as I said, advising both private and public parties. When it comes to Southeast Europe, well, we've been actually working for the Energy Community Secretariat. We published a few months ago, I think it was end of last year, an analysis of the system adequacy, meaning threats, potential threats to security of supply, as well as an analysis of whether capacity mechanisms could be part of the solution in that part of Europe. And as I said, I'll say a few words on that front at the end of my presentation. Let me start with a few additional pieces of background. Craig's been very exhaustive already, so I'll be quite quick. I like to say a few more words on the missing money problem that's been mentioned already by Craig. Typically, this is being caused by what you see here as a blue line on top of that supply stack of different technologies with different marginal costs. You see that price tag is below, essentially, the dashed orange line. And this is causing a missing money, a missing revenue for the different units. In practice, this can be due to price caps, but it can also be due to a range of interventions in the market, either by system operators or by through various types of regulations, which have an impact on price formation. Now, looking at capacity mechanism from a European angle, the European Commission itself has produced a set of documents and guidelines. In fact, the European Commission even launched what it called a sector inquiry. And a sector inquiry in Europe is a pretty in-depth investigation. And this was done 3-4 years ago, but I'm showing you here one of the outcomes of that study. The European Commission distinguished different types of capacity mechanisms. And as you see from these three, the first distinction that's relevant is whether the capacity mechanism is market-wide, so can remunerate all technologies, or whether it's targeted, meaning that it's only remunerating some of the plants or some of the resources. Then you've got a second decision to make. And indeed, the question is whether the mechanism is going to be price-based, so essentially a capacity payment, or whether it's going to be volume-based. So you are going to define a quantity of capacity that you want to reward. And then you have other decisions to make. For instance, do I want the mechanism to be run centrally via a central auction, single procurement mechanism, or do I decentralize that mechanism, for instance, by putting an obligation on suppliers? So these are the broad categories. And when implementing capacity mechanism, one thing is very important in Europe. The European Commission will consider this as state aid, and it will not allow countries to implement on their own capacity mechanism without consulting with the European Commission and without ensuring that the root causes of the missing money that's causing the need for the capacity mechanism are being addressed. So what could be these other reforms that the European Commission would be asking the country to work on? Well, this could have to do with price caps, as I mentioned, could have to be also related to balancing mechanism and scarcity price formation. Market coupling is often an issue, and we know that, for instance, market coupling is not fully implemented in Southeast and Southwest Europe. Finally, we could go into more details of these different types of mechanisms. I don't think we have time to go into the fine print of that table, but I'll say that typically countries in Europe have been favoring either strategic reserves, which we see as one example of a targeted mechanism, or a centralized version of capacity markets, which are market-wide. I'll come back to that in a minute when I give you an overview of who's done what in Europe. So moving on to the experience to date in Europe, best way to represent that is through that map. And you see that we have a patchwork of colors here. Dark blue means capacity market. So these are similar to what Craig mentioned, referring to PJM and to the US capacity markets. When you go to the lighter blue, the strategic reserve is more an out-of-market capacity mechanism to ensure that you keep on the side of the market enough reserve, if you want, to keep the lights on. And in between, you've got capacity payments. Typically in the south of Europe, we had that historically in Spain, Portugal, although it's been discontinued. And it's less in fashion these days. As I said, countries are favoring mostly capacity markets, so dark blue, or strategic reserves. Now, you'll ask me, why is that? That different countries across Europe are going for different approaches. And I'll say, well, it's because the choice of the type of capacity mechanism is very much driven, first by your objective, of course, but also by the specificities of your electricity system. And different countries in Europe have different types of challenges with regard to security of supply in electricity. I'm giving you a few examples here of countries in Europe which have implemented recently or are in the process of implementing a capacity mechanism. In Poland, for instance, the issue was primarily that a good part of the thermal fleet is not necessarily economical anymore, and that was causing a threat of mothballing of a number of plants, leading to a potential issue with security of supply. In France has a lot of electric heating, and peak demand can be extremely spiky in the winter when there is a cold wave. And therefore, it was important for the TSO to ensure supplies, to have extra resources, or to have extra insurance, I should say, at peak times. Germany went for a different approach. Germany went for a strategic reserve, so on the side of the market. And essentially, the problem in Germany is more a locational one. There are great constraints between the north and the south associated with the nuclear phase-out, very strong growth of renewables. So the issue was not so much to get new investment, but it was very much to manage exit from the market in specific locations.
Fabian, I apologize for interrupting you, but I've gotten a note here that folks cannot see your slides in the full screen mode. Is it possible, maybe Albert can help us to make sure that your slides cover the full range of the screen here? They're just a little bit smaller, and with the font size, they're just a little bit harder to read.
Yeah, it's because you're in presenter mode. So we're seeing the display that you're seeing with the next slide coming up and the current slide.
So what does Fabian need to do, Albert?
He needs to turn off the presenter view. I think we'll do it.
Is that any better? I'm showing essentially the slide as I see it. If it doesn't work, the simplest maybe also that I hand over back to you and you take control, Albert. I'm fine with that as well.
Why don't we, in the interest of time, Albert, can we do that?
Yeah, just give me a second. I've got to make some adjustments here.
Sure.
Sorry about that. These are the challenges of, direct projection and this new world in which we are all experimenting.
Now we see a full screen of you. Okay, you gotta go through here.
And which slide are we on?
I think, let's see, you were on slide, which slide were you on, Fabian? It was slide number 11, I think.
Yes, if you can carry on.
There you go. Oh,
yeah,
one before.
That one. Perfect.
That one? Okay. Yes, that's definitely better.
Yeah, I was going to transition actually to the next one. So the important thing to remember is there are different types of capacity mechanisms. There is no one size fits all, and the European Commission will have a say. So I'm presenting here the framework through which the European Commission will assess whether the kind of capacity mechanisms that a country is electing to implement, as to whether this is in line with the stated guidelines. So there are three main steps. First, the country or the large utility behind the implementation will need to justify the need for intervention. So usually the need for intervention is that there is a threat to security of supply, and that therefore the market cannot deliver alone, the energy market. It needs to be supplemented by an intervention. Then it's important to explain how the design, that's the second step, how the design of the capacity mechanism is going to address the issue, meaning the security of supply problem. And what's important is to show the appropriateness of the aid by showing that no more money is going to be granted to plant operators than what is strictly necessary to keep the lights on. So usually this entails essentially stimulating the revenues of different types of resources and showing that the intervention is necessary, but that the aid granted is not excessive, if you want. And there is a final and third step, which is the impact on competition. The European Commission will be willing to double check that the measure, the capacity mechanism, does not adversely affect cross-border trade between countries, but that it doesn't bias competition in the country itself as well. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Essentially, when it comes to implementation, and this is a slightly crowded slide, so I'll highlight the key points. There are 6 main issues that are worth considering. The first one is eligibility. What kind of resources are eligible? Craig mentioned that it could be broad. It could involve, both renewables, thermal, demand side, supply side, storage. But essentially, it's going to be important to define that from the onset. Certification. Obviously, capacity providers will need to get certified to ensure that they are actually able to provide the service that is required for. Availability obligation. Obviously, you are going to have to define the period during which you want the service to be provided. So these can be, for instance, peak times, but they can also apply all year round. Then if it's a centralized mechanism, you are going to have to run an auction. And the auction design parameters can be the subject of a lot of debates, in my experience. Then, of course, you'll have to deal with the contracts themselves. And again, this can be a challenging area. It goes with some complexities. And finally, if you went for reliability options, which is increasingly in fashion in Europe, you'd have to think about the interplay between the energy price and the capacity mechanism. So these are the main areas of focus, I'd say. And to move on to the next slide. The next thing I'd like to flag is that in Europe, particular focus is being paid on ensuring that resources across the border can actually participate in a country capacity mechanism. This is actually one requirement. If you want to implement a capacity market in a given country in Europe, you need to ensure that resources from third-party countries are able to participate. How to do that? Well, you've got different ways to do that, either via the interconnection itself, not necessarily allowing the resources themselves to participate, or explicitly via allowing participation and bids from foreign generators or foreign resources in general. We don't have time to go into the details. This is one of the most debated areas in my experience when implementing capacity mechanisms, because fundamentally this boils down to the question of how much you can trust your neighbors. And we all know that in Europe, particularly in some areas, there have been some, let's put it this way, difficult policy decisions in previous years. There have been some curtailments of imports-exports, for instance, between countries. So I would say that an important prerequisite to cross-border participation in capacity mechanisms is a political agreement, obviously, to ensure a full solidarity in case of a shortage event between countries. So let's move on and perhaps highlight a few last things which are of interest, I trust, to the people on the call. How much money is actually being granted through these capacity markets? I've got an example here from Europe. And we have essentially gathered the last auction results for the UK, France, Ireland, Poland, and Italy. This is the capacity remuneration in euro per megawatt per year for the eligible resources. You have to also make sure you compare different dates with the caveat that these auctions may refer to either T-1, so it's a year in advance of delivery, or T-4, which is 4 years in advance of delivery. So that should help you interpret that chart. And what you see is that typically in the UK and France, capacity auctions have not cleared at a very high level to date. This is very much different from what we've seen in Ireland, Poland, and Italy, where capacity prices have been significantly higher. Why is that? Well, I think we can come back to some of the specificities that we discussed earlier on. In some of these countries, there is a need of new investment, urgent new investment. And of course, if you have to reach the level of new entry, if you want cost, it's quite different from the level of variable cost or fixed cost for some of the existing units when you don't need new investment. So that concludes my overview. If we move to perhaps the next slide, what I'd like to do next is perhaps, if we've got a bit more time, I'm careful of the time here, say a few words on the Western Balkans and that studies that we recently conducted for the Energy Communities Secretariat. I trust this will be of interest to some of the people on the call. So the first thing to say is, what are the specificities of these countries? So we are referring here to Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. Well, these countries are characterized first and foremost by power systems where there is a lot of lignite generation. They are also characterized by what I would call an incomplete liberalization. These countries are not yet part of the European Union. They are in the process of implementing the so-called acquis communautaire, which is essentially the set of legislations governing the single market. And that applies to energy as well, and to electricity markets. So these countries are in the transition towards implementing a number of the European legislations and implementing as well the standard target model for electricity trading in Europe. Now, importantly, these countries have not yet fully implemented all of these regulations. And in particular, they have not necessarily implemented some of the environmental norms or regulations which are limiting the emissions of power plants. And this is to do both with the Large Combustion Plant Directive, the Industrial Emission Directive, which are setting emission standards for some of the local pollutants, sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxide. But it's also important in respect to the emission trading scheme for CO2 in Europe, the carbon market, which is not implemented in these countries yet. If we move to the next slide, why is that relevant? Well, this is relevant because obviously when assessing the profitability of different plants in these countries, one needs to distinguish whether or not there is carbon pricing. And essentially what you see here is net profits, so profits minus cost, essentially, for plants. And we have looked at this plant by plant in these different countries. So net profits in two scenarios. In a base case, which assumes no implementation of carbon pricing, and in a scenario in which we implement carbon pricing along the line of the European trading scheme. And what you see is that although today a number of the plants are struggling, so they are hardly covering their annualized capex in terms of net profits. This is in the case where you have no carbon pricing. So this is the situation today. So although the situation is already difficult for a number of these plants and utilities, when you move to the scenario with carbon pricing, you'd actually see a massive issue here, which is that the vast majority of thermal plants would not cover their costs. So that leads us to my next slide, which is, in a forward-looking exercise, you could anticipate a significant security of supply problem or security of supply risk in these countries. We've run our models to estimate the loss of load expectation, so the number of hours per year, which could result in a power shortage, if you want. And you see on the left that in the base scenario, depending on the country, you have somewhere between 0.1 and 4 hours of lost load by 2025. So this is still in line with the expectation from policymakers. But as soon as you move to implementing carbon pricing and environmental legislations in general, so you move to the right part of my analysis, you see that the numbers go up significantly. And I'd like to draw your attention in particular to the situation in Albania and Serbia, where because of the closures of some of the lignite plants, for instance, there could be a very significant risk for security of supply as early as 2025. So that leads me to my conclusion. If we move to the next slide, what we can say is that further implementation of the EU electricity target model and further implementation of emission standards and ETS could reduce significantly the profits of existing plants in these countries and create a security of supply problem. So this raises an important question on the timing for implementation of carbon pricing first, but also on whether a compensation framework could be put in place at the same time. And if I move to my next slide, as a conclusion, I'd like to offer some thoughts on the roles that capacity mechanism could play. I think that one way to do it, instead of just postponing the compliance with carbon trading and the implementation of these emission standards, would be a phased approach where these are implemented alongside capacity mechanisms. And these capacity mechanisms could provide additional revenue, could cover, as Craig and I explained, the missing money that is required for some of the existing assets, which are necessary for security of supply to stay on, and to trigger new investment. What could be the approach? Well, I think, again, it depends on the country. I cannot be too specific here because we don't have time and we need to wrap up, but you could either have strategic reserves, which would be focusing on keeping some of the existing plants on during the transition, or you could envisage as well a market-wide capacity market, in which case the focus would be very much on attracting new investment. I think this is all I have to say, and maybe to turn to the next two slides. I'd like just to share my contact details with you all on the next slide, and to invite you obviously to reach out if you have any question. As I said, we are actively working in Europe and in the Southeast region on these issues, and I'll be very pleased to discuss these issues further with you. Elliot, may I turn back to you for the
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Fabian, for that tour across different capacity mechanisms and for the benefit of your recent analysis and recommendations. I will say, for those who are in the Electricity Market Initiative group for Southeast Europe, the group that I am the project director for the United States Energy Association, we are going to be having more on this topic. This was, I would call, an appetizer. We're going to have a full main course on capacity markets later this year, a full day, where we'll be talking about the pros and cons, because as our speakers have identified, this is something that that part of the world, that region, Southeast Europe, is really on the verge of. So there's the opportunity to consider all these different pros and cons and the different cross-cutting factors that our speakers have spoken about. And I will just take 30 seconds here to give an advertisement for the EMI, the Electricity Market Initiative. What we're about in that work is to work on trying to accelerate the integration of electricity power markets in Southeast Europe. There are 11 different countries that we're working with, the Western Balkan countries that have been mentioned, but also all of the surrounding countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Slovenia, and Croatia as well. And we are meeting regularly, both in person and virtually these days, doing a number of different studies. Our current study is looking this year at, let's see, share my webcam, okay, is looking this year at particularly the significant additions of new renewables that is expected to take place by 2030, and their impacts on both the market and on the grid, on the congestion and on the contingency analysis on the grid. So we're really highly engaged in trying to get it right with regard to integrating the markets in Southeast Europe, and there's a lot of coupling discussions that are going on, et cetera. We have an article that I wrote recently, which appeared in Public Utilities Fortnightly, about that integration and our analysis for 2025 that you can find on the USEA website. Okay, end of advertisement. So let me now turn to the, excuse me, to the questions that we've had coming in, as well as some that I have as well. Fabian, you talked a bit about it here, but I'll invite you if you want to elaborate. But Craig, I'd be interested in both of your perspectives. What advice would you have for either a country or a region or group of countries that's now just looking at establishing a centralized capacity procurement model? What are sort of the key steps? There's obviously different approaches, but what are the key steps that you need to go through in order to establish such a mechanism? Craig, why don't I start with you?
Okay, thank you. I'll give two sort of watchwords from a lot of history on this. One is incremental approach. This is difficult. You've got years of legacy units. As Fabian talked about, there is a lot of transition needed because you've got carbon pricing potentially and all the disruption that could cause to the need for keeping the lights on in the region. So flash cutting this, which is something California did some years ago, doesn't work. Our capacity market has evolved and continually keeps changing to this day. So that would be one. Two is you have to get buy-in from the policymakers. If you don't have buy-in from the ministry and above, it becomes a very, very difficult effort. So making sure you've got that buy-in, making sure you've got the training for the people who actually have to do this, as well as the incremental approach, well, say now it's three, are all key pieces of advice.
Very good. Thank you. Fabian, anything you want to add to what you previously mentioned?
I'd agree completely with Craig that the important thing is to build up support for it. And I think the way to do it is to understand what is your need in a very specific way. What I mean by that is that it's not sufficient to say I have a security of supply problem. You need to characterize it, and you need to answer the big question as to why the current set of market arrangements wouldn't deliver the incentives and the investments that are required. So that requires, I would say, a fairly chunky preparatory stage. And if you think about Europe, actually this is the biggest hurdle. The biggest hurdle actually in Europe is not necessarily the design now, although I'm not saying it's simple. I agree with Craig, it's going to be incremental, etc. But the good thing is that we can learn from existing schemes. The big hurdle is to convince governments and the European Commission that the intervention is necessary above and beyond some of the existing market reforms. And the Commission may tell you, look, you've got to demonstrate to me that you have understood your issue well and that there are no other ways to solve it, for instance, via reforms of your energy market. So I'd suggest that you should keep that in mind. A capacity market cannot be a substitute for a well-functioning energy market.
These are not standalone. These are integrated markets, and the missing money and the other revenue issues that you talked about are sort of all part and parcel of the same thing. We have a very specific question, and I wish I could give credit to the person who sent in this question, but they sent it anonymously. But it's a very knowledgeable question, and I'll read it to you. It says, given the focus on flexible capacity, when you do a procurement, what types of flexible characteristics do you specify in the bid documents? For example, ramping requirements, number of starts, minimum capacity. What is it that you're requiring for people to be able to specify when they say that they're going to be available in the capacity markets? Craig, maybe I'll start with you again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, this is certainly a lively subject. We deal with a lot of those flexibility requirements in our purchase of reserves in real time and day ahead. Capacity, we're really buying just a call right on megawatts. So although there are performance requirements, a lot of the specific flexibility we need is really more sort of based on system conditions. Summer, winter, mix of generations. So we deal with a lot of that in reserves. Now we're not, some big people would say, well, then you're just piling on, and why don't you just deal with it in the capacity market? The capacity market is sending the investment for just the megawatts, the iron in the ground, if you will. While these other issues, we deal with it in the purchase of reserves in real time, but we don't just layer them on. So there is an offset to capacity revenues for what units are otherwise earning in energy and ancillary service markets. They can't recover them twice, but we found the flexibility characteristics are sort of better dealt with in our reserve markets, where we've just made some significant reforms. And our overall goal, quite frankly, is to try to move more of the focus to those products as we get more renewable resources, and still need a capacity market, but have less emphasis on it. The capacity market is kind of buying sort of just megawatts in the ground, while the reserves are much more flexible. You could combine the two, but again, I'm buying this 3 years forward. So then I would have to make all of these projections about what my reserve requirements are 3 years forward, and end up having to buy additional product more or less in real time. So rather than trying to push them together, we're sort of separated them out. So 3 year forward, I know I need iron in the ground or demand response, etc. In closer to real time, I need a given set of flexible products based on the weather, the economy, what's on the grid, etc.
Fabian, I would imagine you find different systems in different countries. That map that you showed that shows the spectrum, is this an important factor to consider when you're designing a new capacity market? And why don't you talk about how specific should you be with regard to the characteristics of the generation in a capacity design and an auction?
Absolutely, it's a very important thing that you don't just borrow one design that you've got in one place and just implement it in another place. That's actually a recipe for failure, in my experience. You need to understand, as I said, what is the precise needs that you're targeting. And you need to think about the definition of your product. What is it that you're actually procuring? And that should be, I mean, to Craig's point, that should be articulated with your specific market design and your specific approach locally for procuring reserves. Very much like in the US, to come back to the previous question, I mean, in Europe, capacity markets are primarily targeted at what is called adequacy. So ensuring that you've got enough resources to cover demand. The flexibility is being addressed primarily through reserves. Although there are different schools of thoughts, and we are having in a number of countries in Europe a lively debate as to whether we should evolve towards a second generation of capacity market, which would be more like capability markets, in the sense that you wouldn't just look at the nameplate capacity, you'd also have a number of constraints which could obviously incorporate flexibility as well as other things. But yeah, to come back to your question, all of this implies that you'll have to almost find a different design for the specificities of your country. There are a number of generic elements, but you'll need to fine tune it.
Very good. Thank you. We have another question that's come in. It's more targeted for you, Craig, and it's one that actually that I had as well as I looked at your slides that show that the contribution of renewables is relatively light, if I may say, to so far. It's rising, as you pointed out, but I think it was 5.4% or whatever of the energy, at this point. And the question that's come in is, it seems that growth in renewable generation is higher in other parts of the country than in the PJM. Is that because they are not valued in the capacity market or for some other reason? Or I'll add to the question, do you expect that renewables contribution will significantly rise over time? And what issues do you think that's going to pose?
So taking them, will it rise over time? Yes. And that's got a set of issues which I'll come back to in a moment. Why it's not greater in the PJM region? It's a great question. A couple of reasons for that. One is just the land topology. For solar, for example, for utility scale solar requires a lot of land. Land's in short supply in the densely populated parts of PJM. Rooftop solar, as of today, really sort of behind the meter resources don't participate in the capacity market because we don't have the visibility and dispatchability, but we've got a lot of rooftop solar. So those numbers sort of hide the fact that there is a lot of renewable generation, just not necessarily participating in the capacity market. But do I expect it to rise? Yes, we do. It's always, particularly for wind in our region, I think it's always going to be significantly discounted. Solar less so, but wind, I mean, we just, don't have the same level of wind resources as perhaps other countries and other parts of the country. So I think it'll be discounted. Offshore wind is an interesting issue. Offshore wind is an interesting issue, at least in the US. If anything, to be honest, the capacity market as it presently exists really sort of works against the deployment of offshore wind, only because of its expense. It's very costly to do, and you've got that resource competing against a whole lot of both onshore wind and solar and natural gas, and I've got excess capacity. So offshore wind almost requires sort of a special government-driven push at this point, which is its own set of controversy associated with that. But at least in the US, it has not been very economic to date for a significant deployment of offshore wind.
Well, you talked about that, Craig, in your presentation. You said that the capacity markets don't really favor policy-oriented resources. They're a market based on cost and on pricing. And if you want to bring in other resources for other reasons, then decision makers, policymakers can do that. But it's not really intended to be part of the capacity market.
Well, and let me just clarify that point, put a sharper point on that, which is, if policymakers want to choose particular types of resources irrespective of cost, the capacity market works against that. But if there was carbon pricing, for example, in the region or even in several states, those policies do get reflected in the capacity market. Energy prices reflect that, the dispatch reflects that. That then ends up pushing out units that are not as dispatched, become more uneconomic, and therefore can't make it in the capacity market. So it's sort of, I should put a finer point on it, saying what kind of policy, how the policy is structured, the capacity market can be either very compatible with, if it's like across the board carbon pricing, if it's I want to support offshore wind, I don't care what it costs, then this is not the market for you.
Fabian, let me ask you to address that as well. As you well know, many of the European countries are encouraging renewables. There's a strong drive towards climate change mitigation in Europe. Just the recent EU economic recovery package has tremendous investments, I think on the order of 200 billion euros set aside, for such more sustainability type of investments, and the clean energy package and Green Deal. So the renewables, talk about the renewables play in both the capacity and in the market in general in Europe, if you would.
So there are different schools of thought. In some capacity mechanisms, some capacity markets include renewables, others exclude, but there is a general rule that applies everywhere. You cannot have double remuneration. So if you are a subsidized renewables through a feed-in tariff or a contract for difference, etc., you cannot get capacity remuneration on top of it. However, if you are a merchant renewable operator, that's a different question, and then obviously you are eligible to potentially participate. So that's my first point. Then we are having, obviously, when we implement these mechanisms, quite a lot of debate on how the product definition and how the certification process will actually be more or less favorable to renewables. What I mean by that, let's take a very concrete example. Whether you derate wind or solar to 10% or to 40% of their nameplate capacity will obviously make a big difference as to how much revenue they can get from the capacity market. So that derating methodology is extremely important, and I'd say it's important because it has to reflect the actual contribution to security of supply of these resources. But at the same time, you need to be careful that it does not discriminate between resources if they are both able or if they are all able to provide that security. And one final point, perhaps, the kind of debates we are having here regarding renewables are also regarding the approach for bidding. Do you bid based on a unit by unit approach? Or do you allow portfolio bidding? Because if you allow portfolio bidding for renewables, obviously the aggregate contribution and variability of production of that portfolio is going to be lower than if you bid on a unit by unit basis. So you see there are a number of dimensions through which you can actually make your capacity market more or less friendly to renewables.
Fascinating. Thank you. I have one last question that has come in, actually two questions. We're right at the time now when we were planning to wrap up, but for those of you who can stay on for another couple of minutes, and I see that most of the people who've signed on are still engaged with us, which is great. I'm going to combine two questions here into one, and then we'll wrap it up. Let me refresh my screen here. Okay, so the two questions that have come in is, how do you see the advent and the increases in electric vehicles affecting the capacity markets and affecting, I guess, maybe markets in general, but in particular, when we look at the demand side and at the resources on the distribution system, electric vehicles in particular. And then secondly, the question is, with the deployment of electrification of buildings, peak loads are going to fluctuate. To discourage use of strategic reserves is the question. So both of these questions are really designed to look at the distribution system and how you can integrate both building loads and an electric vehicle. So maybe again, Craig, I'll start with you on those.
Actually, I was going to defer to Fabian. I'd like to hear what he has to say on this issue first.
Please go ahead.
I can start. And broadly speaking, the question you're asking is both, I think, about how do I incorporate the capacity into a capacity mechanism, the demand side things. You know, electric vehicles are going to play out via the demand side of the market, as well as potentially storage or decentralized resources. So I think you have the first question, which is the size and the level, the threshold for participation. You can manage that via aggregation. So if you've got a lot of small resources, one way to have them participate in a capacity market that has a minimum threshold is via aggregators, of course. I think that's also one way to think about the demand side, because obviously on the demand side, some of it is being dealt with by suppliers who participate, but some of it, and we've seen that in a number of capacity markets in Europe, we've seen a number of active aggregators of demand response securing contracts. And I would think that the deployment of electric vehicles is going to provide more potential to provide demand response. So that's a quick start at it. And I don't know, Craig, if you want to add more.
Yeah, I will just add that we have been through a major debate in the United States that actually went to the United States Supreme Court, of all things, on whether demand response resources can be considered supply side resources and compensated as supply side resources through aggregators, or whether they're strictly load reductions through which customers get a reduced bill and control their load that way, and they're treated solely as a reduction in demand. A huge debate. That debate went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually affirmed it could be on the supply side. It's interesting, we asked 9 justices who know nothing about this topic to make this decision, but we did. And my vision, to be honest, for the future, just speaking for myself, is that we continue to have these resources on the supply side. You start using behind the meter resources as capacity resources, not just load reductions. To do that, you need 2 things. You need visibility into these resources, and you need dispatchability of these resources. So those are the 2 elements. Aggregators can provide that, but it requires a degree of metering, a degree of telecommunications that I think is achievable. But to me, that is the future. And to me, the capacity market will be enriched in the best sense and more diverse than ever if those resources can fully be monetized in the capacity market.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you both for this tour de force of reviewing the options and capacity markets. Your knowledge is prodigious. We all appreciate that very, very much. I would encourage those on the line still with us to regularly check on the USEA website for other webinars and for other educational programs that we are running on a continuing basis. I want to again thank all of our participants, as I mentioned, from 17 different countries around the world. I want to thank our speakers, our wonderful speakers here again. I want to thank again the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, without whom we would not be able to carry on and to support and be our partners in these programs. On behalf of the United States Energy Association, I wish you a good rest of the day, and thank you for participating in this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.